Picture this. It's 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, 1916. Across 18 miles of French countryside, 100,000 British soldiers are about to climb out of their trenches and walk, yes, walk, directly into machine gun fire. By sunset, 60,000 of them would be casualties. 20,000 would never see another sunrise. What you're about to witness is the story of the Battle of the Somme, not just one of the bloodiest days in military history, but a turning point that would reshape warfare, technology, and the very soul of nations forever. This isn't just about trenches and artillery. This is about how human ingenuity, stubborn pride, and technological revolution collided in the most catastrophic way possible. Welcome. Today we're exploring not just what happened at the Somme, but why it happened. How cutting-edge technology of 1916 both saved and doomed hundreds of thousands of lives, and the innovations born from this nightmare that still influence us today. But first, let me ask you something that might seem impossible to answer. How do you coordinate an attack involving more people than live in most cities, using communication technology that would seem ancient to us while under constant artillery bombardment? Stick around because the answer will blow your mind. To understand the Somme, we need to rewind to 1916. World War I had been raging for 2 years, and Europe was locked in a deadly stalemate. The Western Front had become a 400-mile scar across France and Belgium, a maze of trenches, barbed wire, and no man's land that stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. But here's what most people don't realize about trench warfare. It wasn't just holes in the ground. These were underground cities. The German trenches on the Somme were masterpieces of military engineering. Some bunkers buried 40 feet deep, connected by tunnels, complete with electricity, running water, and ventilation systems. They had built themselves an underground fortress. The British, meanwhile, had been frantically innovating. They developed new artillery techniques, primitive aerial reconnaissance, and were experimenting with something that would change warfare forever. But we'll get to that later. The stage was set for what military planners believed would be the decisive breakthrough of the war. 3 men would orchestrate this massive gamble. General Douglas Haig, the British commander who believed cavalry charges could still win modern wars, General Henry Rawlinson, who would lead the actual attack, and Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, the brilliant German commander whose defensive preparations would prove devastatingly effective. The numbers are staggering. The British assembled 1.5 million shells for the preliminary bombardment. They dug 12 miles of new trenches just for the attack. They brought up 60,000 horses, yes, horses in 1916, to support the advance. The logistical challenge was like organizing the D-Day landings with World War I technology. But here's the first technological twist in our story: communication. How do you coordinate an attack involving 750,000 soldiers across 18 miles when your best communication technology is the telephone and the phone lines keep getting cut by artillery? The answer reveals both the ingenuity and the tragic limitations of 1916 technology. The British used field telephones connected by hundreds of miles of cable buried 6 feet underground. When those failed, which they constantly did, they relied on signal flags, flare guns, carrier pigeons, and runners. Runners who had to sprint across shell-torn battlefields with messages that could mean life or death for thousands of soldiers. This communication nightmare would doom the British attack before it even began. June 24, 1916. For 7 days and 7 nights, the British unleashed what they called the week-long hurricane. 1,500 artillery pieces fired 1.5 million shells at the German lines. The sound could be heard in London, 140 miles away. Soldiers reported that the vibrations from the bombardment made it impossible to write letters. The paper would shake too violently. But here's where technology and tactics collided catastrophically. The British were using 2 types of shells, high explosive and shrapnel. Sounds devastating, right? Wrong. About 30% of their shells were duds. They simply didn't explode. The metallurgy and manufacturing techniques of 1916 weren't advanced enough to ensure reliable detonation of mass-produced ammunition. Even worse, shrapnel shells were designed to kill soldiers in the open, not destroy fortified positions. They were basically giant shotgun shells that burst in the air and rained metal balls down on the enemy. Terrifying if you're standing in a field, useless if you're hiding in a bunker 40 feet underground. The Germans had learned from earlier battles. Their bunkers weren't just deep, they were engineered to withstand direct artillery hits. Reinforced concrete, steel beams, multiple chambers connected by tunnels. While the British bombardment destroyed the surface landscape and cut most of the barbed wire, the German soldiers simply waited underground, playing cards and writing letters home. But the British did have some technological advantages. They were pioneers in artillery science, using mathematical calculations to improve accuracy, experimenting with new fuse designs, and developing creeping barrages where artillery fire would move forward in timed intervals to protect advancing infantry. They also had a secret weapon that nobody talks about, the first military use of sound ranging. By using microphones placed at different positions, they could triangulate the location of enemy artillery with surprising accuracy. This technology, developed specifically for the Somme, would later evolve into modern acoustic detection systems. And then there was aerial reconnaissance. The British had over 400 aircraft supporting the Somme offensive, more than had ever been concentrated in one battle. These flimsy wood and fabric biplanes were taking photographs, directing artillery fire, and engaging in the world's first large-scale aerial combat operations. June 30th, 1916. The final day of bombardment saw the heaviest artillery barrage in human history up to that point. 250,000 shells fired in a single day. British commanders were confident that nothing could survive such devastation. They were about to discover how wrong they were. As the sun set on June 30th, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. After 7 days of continuous thunder, the quiet was almost supernatural. In the German bunkers, soldiers began climbing back to their positions. They cleaned their machine guns, checked their ammunition, and waited. They didn't have to wait long. 7:30 a.m., July 1st, 1916. Along 18 miles of front, whistles blew. 100,000 British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began walking toward the German lines. Not running, walking. In neat, orderly lines, carrying 60 pounds of equipment each. Why walking? This wasn't suicidal stupidity. It was based on a technological assumption that proved catastrophically wrong. British commanders believed their 7-day bombardment had destroyed all German resistance. They thought their biggest problem would be maintaining order during the occupation of abandoned German trenches. The soldiers were loaded down with supplies to hold their new positions: extra ammunition, barbed wire, wooden posts, tools for digging. Some carried tea and supplies for victory celebrations. The plan was to walk across no man's land, about 300 yards on average, occupy the German trenches, and then push forward to achieve the breakthrough that would end the war. What they encountered instead was one of the most perfectly executed defensive operations in military history. The German MG-08 machine gun could fire 600 rounds per minute with deadly accuracy up to 2,000 yards. Each German regiment had 12 of these weapons, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that covered every inch of no man's land. The mathematics of destruction were simple and horrible. A single machine gun could cut down an entire company of men in less than a minute. The Germans had 1,000 machine guns waiting for the British attack. Do the math, and you'll understand why July 1st became the blackest day in British military history. But here's something fascinating that most people don't know. The battle wasn't a complete failure everywhere. In the southern sectors, where different tactics were used and the terrain was more favorable, several British units achieved their objectives. The 30th Division captured Montauban, and the French First Army, attacking alongside the British, was remarkably successful. What made the difference? Technology and tactics. In the successful sectors, British forces used more sophisticated artillery techniques. Shorter, more intense bombardments focused on specific targets rather than the week-long general bombardment. They also had better communication with their artillery, allowing for more responsive fire support. Let me tell you about Private Billy McFadzean of the 36th Ulster Division. On the morning of July 1st, he was in a crowded trench when a box of grenades was accidentally knocked over. 2 grenades had their pins pulled and were about to explode among dozens of his comrades. McFadzean threw himself on top of the grenades, saving everyone around him at the cost of his own life. He was 20 years old and became the youngest recipient of the Victoria Cross on the Somme. By 8:30, just 1 hour into the attack, it was clear that the offensive had failed catastrophically in most sectors. But communication technology in 1916 made it nearly impossible to call off the attack quickly. Remember those telephone lines? Most were cut within minutes of the bombardment ending. Signal flags were useless in the smoke and chaos. Carrier pigeons were shot down or flew in the wrong direction. So the attacks continued throughout the day. Wave after wave of men walking into machine gun fire because their commanders, miles behind the lines, had no way of knowing what was happening. By evening, the casualty figures were almost impossible to comprehend. 60,000 British casualties in a single day, including 20,000 dead. To put that in perspective, that's more casualties than the entire American Civil War Battle of Gettysburg, which lasted 3 days. The Somme achieved that carnage in about 8 hours. But here's where our story takes a fascinating turn toward innovation. The failure of July 1st didn't end the Battle of the Somme. It transformed it into a 4-month laboratory for military technology that would change warfare forever. September 15, 1916. For the first time in human history, mechanical monsters crawled across a battlefield. The British Mark I tank, all 28 tons of it, lumbered toward German lines at the blazing speed of 3.7 miles per hour. These weren't the sleek machines we think of today. They were basically mobile bunkers powered by aircraft engines operated by crews of 8 men cooking inside steel ovens. Inside a Mark I, the temperature could reach 125 degrees Fahrenheit. The noise was deafening, 2 aircraft engines running at full power inside a steel box. The crew communicated through hand signals because speaking was impossible. They breathed air thick with carbon monoxide fumes and had to wear special masks to avoid being poisoned by their own engine exhaust. But they worked, sort of. Of the 49 tanks that began the attack on September 15th, only 32 made it to the German lines. The rest broke down, got stuck, or were abandoned by crews overcome by heat and fumes.
But those 32 tanks achieved something remarkable. They punched holes in German defenses that had been impregnable for 2 years. The Somme became a proving ground for rapid technological evolution. The British developed new artillery techniques almost weekly. Box barrages, creeping barrages, predicted fire, all innovations born from the desperate need to support infantry attacks more effectively. Communication technology also evolved frantically. When telephone lines proved too vulnerable, the British developed new techniques. Buried cables with multiple redundant routes, wireless telegraphy adapted for battlefield use, and even primitive radio communication between aircraft and ground forces. The massive casualties also drove medical innovation. The Battle of the Somme saw the first widespread use of blood transfusions on a battlefield, mobile X-ray units, and systematic triage systems that prioritized patients based on their likelihood of survival rather than the severity of their injuries. In the skies above the Somme, aviation technology advanced at breakneck speed. When the battle began, aircraft were primarily used for reconnaissance. By the end, they were conducting the first strategic bombing raids, the first coordinated ground attack missions, and engaging in aerial combat using specialized fighter aircraft. The Germans weren't sitting idle either. They developed new defensive techniques, elastic defense systems that absorbed attacks rather than trying to stop them completely, new types of gas attacks, and improved artillery that could provide immediate response to any British breakthrough. But perhaps the most significant innovation was invisible on the battlefield: industrial mobilization. The Somme consumed materials at an unprecedented rate. Britain was producing 50,000 shells per day by the end of 1916, more than their entire pre-war stockpile. This industrial revolution would prove more decisive than any individual weapon. The battle also drove advances in metallurgy, chemistry, and precision manufacturing that would benefit civilian industry for decades after the war ended. When the Battle of the Somme officially ended on November 18, 1916, the statistics were staggering. Over 1 million casualties from all sides combined. The British advanced exactly 6 miles, at a cost of roughly 125,000 casualties per mile of ground gained. But measuring the Somme in miles gained misses the point entirely. This battle didn't just change the map, it changed the world. The technologies developed and refined during those 4 months would influence warfare, industry, and society for generations. Those primitive tanks evolved into the armored warfare that would dominate World War II and beyond. The communication systems pioneered at the Somme laid the groundwork for modern military communications. The industrial mobilization techniques developed to supply the battle became the foundation for modern logistics and supply chain management. The medical innovations were equally significant. Techniques for treating massive trauma developed from treating Somme casualties advanced surgery and emergency medicine by decades. The prosthetics industry was revolutionized by the need to help thousands of amputees return to productive lives. The aviation advances had perhaps the most far-reaching consequences. The aircraft industry, driven by the desperate needs of Somme air operations, would eventually produce the passenger aviation industry that connects our modern world. But the most profound changes were social and cultural. The Somme marked the end of 19th-century optimism about progress and technology. Before the Somme, new technology was seen as inherently beneficial to humanity. After the Somme, we began to understand that technological advancement could be a double-edged sword. The battle also changed how we remember war. The massive casualties led to new forms of commemoration. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, Remembrance Day poppies, and war memorials in thousands of towns across the British Empire all trace their origins to the need to honor the Somme dead. Even today, the Somme continues to reveal its secrets. Battlefield archaeologists regularly discover artifacts that tell us new things about the battle. In 2016, exactly 100 years after the battle, archaeologists found a perfectly preserved German bunker system that showed just how sophisticated their defensive preparations had been. The Somme battlefield is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, preserved not just as a memorial but as a classroom. Military academies around the world still study the battle as an example of how technology, tactics, and leadership interact in warfare. The lessons of the Somme remain relevant today. Modern conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan have seen similar challenges, adapting new technology to battlefield realities, maintaining communication in chaotic environments, and learning that technological superiority doesn't automatically guarantee victory. So what can we learn from the Battle of the Somme? First, that innovation often comes from our darkest moments. The technologies that define our modern world, from automotive engineering to aviation, from industrial logistics to emergency medicine, all bear the fingerprints of lessons learned in those muddy fields of northern France. Second, that technological advancement without tactical wisdom can be catastrophic. The British had superior numbers, more advanced artillery, and innovative new weapons, but they lacked the tactical flexibility to use these advantages effectively until it was almost too late. And finally, that every statistic represents individual human stories.
Behind those massive casualty figures were hundreds of thousands of individual acts of courage, sacrifice, and determination that deserve to be remembered not just as numbers, but as examples of human resilience in the face of unimaginable challenges. The Battle of the Somme lasted 141 days and changed the world forever. It showed us both the terrible potential of modern technology and the incredible capacity of human beings to innovate, adapt, and endure under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into one of history's most significant battles. If you enjoyed learning about how technology and human ingenuity collided at the Somme, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Remember the lessons of the Somme, that innovation often comes from our greatest challenges, that technology alone never guarantees victory, and that behind every historical statistic are individual human stories that deserve to be told.